Welcome to Hardscrabble History. I'm going to talk today about an ongoing project that I've been working on using the Civil War knapsack. Kind of some history, my personal history with this knapsack, because any of those of you are aware of Civil War equipment, you'll know that this was not the standard knapsack during the American Civil War. And kind of what my plan is and what I've already started working on behind it, why I'm using it, and what my goal is. So, from what I can determine, this is an 1861 knapsack. It would have been used primarily by the militias. It is a hard box knapsack, or from what I've read a little bit online, Prussian-style knapsack. It's got a pretty hard wooden box around it that you can use, for the most part, to store the materials you would have needed on campaign. It's unlike what I think was probably a much more common knapsack, which was essentially just two bags that you folded on one another and then would wear on your back. I'll put a picture of one up. So this isn't probably the most accurate. I've had it since I was in high school. I was doing Civil War reenacting a lot through high school, early college. And I ended up getting this one because I thought it looked cooler. So that's the determination that that's authentic. But I did 5th Newark reenacting at the time. I don't think it was probably the most authentic knapsack I could have had for that impression. I'm not sure what they carried, but I don't think this was the most impressive. Now, my goal and why I am so focused on this knapsack is I would like to work myself up to the point that I can do the full 20 miles a day that a Civil War soldier would have marched during the American Civil War. That was the goal of most Union armies or Confederate armies, was to march 20 miles a day, and that was what their soldiers were expected to do. And I'll talk a little bit in this video about some of the history of that. It takes a long time for soldiers to get there, but on average, on those marches, Civil War soldiers carried about 80 pounds of equipment with them, and one of the pieces of that equipment would have been the knapsack. It would have been a major one. This is their storage. It would have held their blanket, their shelter half, because soldiers carried each part of the half, one with their partner, one with the other part, some of the tent stakes, personal items that they would have wanted on the march, and things like that. So this is, if you do any backpacking, this is where they carried a majority of their personal stuff. Food would have been carried in a haversack, along with any utensils used to eat that food. And then per campaign, what you would store inside the knapsack would change. I found a website that from a reenacting group that kind of went over kind of the basic items that Civil War soldiers would have carried in their knapsack, and things changed based off of season. Up here was meant for carrying the greatcoat, which was a giant coat used by Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. That'd be more useful in the winter, but it would be heavy to carry around in the summer. So soldiers would have discarded it and maybe put their blanket up here, especially as they might have needed to put other materials inside the knapsack. Now, like I said, my goal is to try to work myself up to being able to do the 20 miles a day. It's kind of a fitness goal of mine. I really enjoyed doing practicing for something like this in high school. I practiced to do the Bataan Death March, Memorial Death March in New Mexico. I went to a military high school, and we used modern rucks, and was really enjoyed the training process with it, because it was just essentially hiking. And I did a lot of hiking. I even used this knapsack when I was in Boy Scouts once or twice on some backpacking trips, but I didn't pack it like the Civil War soldiers would have packed it. Civil War, I mentioned it briefly, but Civil War soldiers would kind of pack per campaign that they were going to go on. So I'll link a video in the description of the Civil War Digest that did a very good video on what soldiers would have carried into the Chancellorsville campaign for the Union Army. But for the most part, I've packed this for what you would standard seen soldiers to carry into the field with them. And so I am missing a few things. I'm missing a gum blanket, which would have been a poncho for a Civil War soldier, and a ground cloth. I have them, but they were very low quality and they melted. And I also am missing my shelter half. and tent stakes. And so what I have decided to do for the sake of just making sure I have the weight in this knapsack for trying to get myself up to doing the 20 miles is I just put a 5-pound weight to make up for the missing items that I don't have. Since the blanket is on this side of the knapsack, it's a little more of a fight to get it open. But now that I've got it open, you can kind of see a little bit on the inside here. All right, they would have kept a blanket in here with them. I've stuck a 5-pound weight inside the blanket because I'm trying to make up for that missing weight. Here would have been also an extra undershirt. They would have carried any personal items they wanted with them in here as well. Socks, an extra pair of socks. This is my own modern day socks. I don't have any Civil War styled socks, and maybe someday I'll pack those in here. And a housewife is what I put in here as another personal item, which would have been just used for mending their uniforms and things like that, the basic things they're going to need for it. I also have stuck a Bible in here. It's not a modern Bible, but Civil War soldiers would have been carrying Bibles around with them if they were permitted to do so. Again, certain campaign orders, as you'll see if you watch the Chancellorsville video that I will link below, certain orders sometimes forbid and asked officers to ensure that men were not carrying Bibles with them into the field. It wasn't just because they just hated religion or anything, but they wanted that space for food or other equipment for the soldiers to use in the field. Like I said, I'm missing some items. I'd like to get those items in here at some point, but I haven't gotten those things in here yet. And my goal mostly is just to get the weight right and try to get that weight distributed correctly. Now, I did a 5-mile hike today. My goal is, with any fitness sort of thing, you want to start off small and work your way up to the distances you want to go. And so, for the most part, I did that 5 miles. The main thing I noticed, one of the ways that they hook the straps in is with this hook. And that hook would go straight into my back while I was on that 5-mile hike. It was a little uncomfortable, but it wasn't the end of the world for the most part. Now, I'll put up some information on each mile I went, kind of some things I thought about on each one, and other things like that. I am missing most of that 80 pounds of equipment. This knapsack only carries about 17 pounds at the moment. Civil War soldiers would have had their haversack, would have had all their food, cooking and eating utensils in it, and a canteen that they would have been hanging over them at the same time. I don't have those things with me at the moment. I will at some point, but those items also would add weight, along with the rifle, which I'm not going to walk around my neighborhood with a rifle. What I mostly noticed is these straps on my hike today. These straps, they dig mostly into your upper shoulders. It's not really painful, but it just basically feels like you're working out a certain muscle that you're not used to working out because they just sit differently on your back. And the other thing I appreciated and also did not care for a whole lot was this strap system. It's easy to take this the knapsack on and off because you can just hook it in there, and so you can get one arm in and then get the other arm and hook it in as needed. But for the most part, it is pretty easy to put on and take off. Right, so like I said, this would have been your standard knapsack for a soldier at the beginning of the war, especially as they're coming out of militia stockpiles and they're just trying to get men into the field. What I'm primarily interested in is getting an understanding and feeling for what the soldiers would have been feeling. I got this inspiration for this from 2 books. One is called, I believe, Life on the Oregon Trail, and the other is Life on the Mississippi River. The author of those 2 books is a journalist, if I remember correctly, and what his goal was primarily looking at trying to understand what life on those 2 trips were. On the Oregon Trail one, he eventually makes a wagon has a horse team, and he's just trying to follow the Oregon Trail and get an idea of what that life may have felt like or been like. We can never get a perfect picture of the past, but we can get a partial one by recreating and redoing things people did in the past. And the second book is about using a flatboat go down the Mississippi River. In both of those, he isn't super interested in having the perfect recreation of a flatboat. He has to have a radio and things like that, and he wants some creature comforts in there. And at the same time, I'm not deeply on my own interest making sure that it is absolutely perfect. Although I do want to work up from not having just the knapsack. I want to eventually be wearing the haversack, the canteen, be in uniform, and using period correct footwear and things like that. I really want to understand the complete misery that it could have been to go on one of these 20-mile marches. It's also important to note they didn't just march one day 20 miles and then just not march the next day. Sometimes they did. But these on campaigns, you might march 20 miles one day, 20 miles the next day, and then 20 miles again the day after that, just depending on where the soldier was operating. And so I want to get to a point where I can do that for maybe a week. And so this is going to take a long time before I get there, and I'll post some periodic updates as I go along. But overall, that's kind of the general takeaway when it comes to the knapsack, what I'm expecting, what the project I'm working on is. And it's really just get the best understanding of what it would have been like as a Civil War soldier and things like that, marching in the field. Some things that are kind of the flaw in my experiment is that I do not have a group of people I'm with. I'm not in a column. My local neighborhood only has paved trails for the most part. And so that is a major drawback. Advantage, the soil doesn't slip from underneath me as much. But it does kind of help speed me up a little bit. So over time, I'm probably going to focus in on trying to get to a point where I am mostly doing it on a more trail basis and things like that. I'll probably never have a giant crowd with me when I go do these things. But for the most part, that's kind of the goal. So after I completed the 5 miles today that I did, this kind of is the general breaking down of the information. Again, average Civil War soldier was expected to march about 20 miles a day, and I want to really hit to that point. So my average speed today was 3.2 miles per hour. I only went that 5 miles, and if I could keep up that rate, I would have hit 20 miles after about 6 hours and 25 minutes. Which would have been a pretty good pace, although, again, that's all reliant on me being able to keep up the pace that I was already on at 3.2 miles per hour. As I got on longer, I probably would have gotten slower after the 5 miles because I certainly felt more tired after about 4 or 5 miles. And I'm going to talk about it when I talk about the laps, but there are some things that would have changed things for the Civil War soldiers to maybe slow down their time or maybe sped up that time. But for the most part, I'm hitting the kind of the time goal that I need to be going and the pace that I need to be going, which isn't very fast, which kind of surprised me when I really thought about it. It would all really depend on how fast my commanding officer, if I was a Civil War soldier, would really be wanting me to get somewhere. And at the current moment, that's really not a limitation that I'm being put on myself. I'm allowed to go the speeds I want to go. So that kind of gives you an idea of what my cadence and things like that were going. If you're curious how much calories I burned on this, you can see it there. Now, when it comes to the laps, like I said, I did 5 miles. That sixth lap is about a quarter of a mile. And it just was the time that it took me to get back home after I was hit the 5 mile mark. Now, my first mile was at about a 17-minute pace. The second mile, I was going through my neighborhood, and my neighborhood is mostly paved. I got to a city park, and I was interested in trying to go off of that city park or go into that city park where they don't have paved trails, and try to go on those for a little bit. And I would be able to maybe avoid needing that sixth lap at the bottom. But when I got to the trailhead, it turns out I needed to pay money. I didn't know I needed to pay money. And so I fiddled around with the Pay by Phone app, but I didn't have my wallet with me, so I couldn't put in my card information. Ultimately, I decided to turn around and just go back to the trail I was on for my neighborhood. I think ultimately the real only lesson that could really be taken out of that is most Civil War soldiers were going to encounter issues on the march while they were out and about. Most famously, the march from Washington, D.C. to Manassas for the first Manassas campaign was only about 30 miles, and it took the Union Army a number of days to actually cover that distance. And there's a number of reasons for why they struggled to cover that distance. Primarily, they had delays with trees being cut down by the Confederate Army blocking the road, or issues where the column would halt and the rear of the column would fall out to go get water or blackberries and things like that. Just a general lack of military discipline, or a variety of other delays that occurred on that march to kind of drag that 30-mile march, which should have been a day and a half maybe, of marching into a multi-day escapade. And it caused a lot of problems for that campaign. And that wasn't a isolated issue for the Union Army. The Confederate Army had the same issue going into the Battle of Shiloh. They also had a very similar distance to need to cover, and they covered it over days when they meant to cover it only in a few days or 1 or 2 days. And they were really surprised they still caught Grant off guard at Shiloh. Right, so it's not just like it was one army. The Union Army was really struggling with it, and the others were not. But for the most part, I was keeping a pretty good pace. I actually started to speed up for the 5th mile, but that was probably because mentally I knew it was the last mile. So it is kind of interesting to look at these numbers and kind of get an idea on what my pace was looking like. And for the most part, it was fairly consistent, although I was starting to get slower as time went on, right? Compared to my first mile and my last mile, I'm going to start to slow down, which is just normal. And so this is kind of why I'm not doing it in Civil War gear initially. I want to get in better shape so that I can do the whole march in normal clothing before I start adding in more weight and start adding in more distance and trying to keep up with that pace a little bit differently. So this has been a really interesting kind of first day. I'm probably going to try to do it maybe 1 or 2 more times this week as I work up, and I'll give you guys an update at the end of next week. This isn't going to be the only content that I'm really going to focus on here. It's not going to just be Civil War reenacting type stuff. I'm not have a ton of interest in doing that sort of thing. I'm more interested in academic history and really being able to present that to a wider audience. But I do really think there's some value in doing this, as with all reenacting or living history type things. You want to be able to engage with it so we can get a better understanding of what things were like in the past. It will never be perfect because we just simply weren't there. But I will be able to get some kind of idea, especially once I start to incorporate more gear into each of these, what it was like for the people who participated in these events and went on these campaigns. And that is valuable historical insight. It's not perfect insight. I've already kind of discussed some of the limitations that I'll kind of face overall, but I look forward to continuing to do this. If you have any input, things I should maybe be changing, if you know I should change some things with my knapsack, or maybe some other suggestions that you have, or just want to tell me I'm an idiot, you're more than welcome to do so. But I really appreciate you for watching. I thank you for spending some time to look at this, and I'll talk to you next time.